Welcome to today's session, which is on academic writing. And the last special session was on managing academic references and finding academic literature. So this here is the next step in the series, and we are going to look at strategies to improve your academic writing. And even if right now you feel like writing seminar papers and one day writing your thesis in your bachelor or master is a huge task and you don't enjoy academic writing, there are specific strategies that we're going to cover today that will drastically improve your academic writing. So it's just like coding, it's a skill that you can practice, and we're going to look at these things today. First of all, the importance of academic writing, of course. So writing is the skill, it's central to academia, right? A researcher who's not good at writing is not able to communicate the results of his or her research with the research community. So we have research papers in academia, which are the structured communication of research findings. So we're going to discuss also the structure of a research paper. And there's a nice quote, which is a bit harsh, but it is, "A man who can think and does not know how to express what he thinks is at the level of him who cannot think," right? So yes, if you cannot get your ideas to paper or your ideas communicated in a direct manner, then other people cannot follow your insights. So this was a quote by Pericles, who lived over 2,400 years ago in Athens, and this quote is still relevant today. This would be like what academics should follow today. So writing is thought made visible. Another nice quote, because only if we can put things to paper can other people see what we did. And also speaking is thought made audible. So there's really three key skills, which are thinking, then writing, and speaking, right? And today we're looking at writing, and hopefully that will also help you think better. Because when we're writing, we're forced to think and restructure our thoughts as well. So what is academic writing? We're going to look at what makes academic writing different from other kinds of writing. Then we're going to look at how to structure your paper. So we're looking at seminar papers. If you're doing the theoretical track in the seminar, you will be writing a longer seminar paper, but you might also be writing reports. And so this also helps, as well as later with your thesis. When you do your degree, you will be writing a long piece of work. So then we'll briefly just review how to cite related work. And this was already covered in the last session, but just 2 slides on that. And then we have a big session on editing. So strategies to improve your writing, how to edit your work for strength and clarity. And then lastly, how to write an abstract. We have a little recipe for that and some tips, so that will save you time later on in your seminar papers or thesis. And yes, all of these topics are skills for, like I said, the seminar, also other projects where you write a report at the end, or your thesis at the end, where you make a contribution to the research field. So even if the contribution is small, you are contributing knowledge that hasn't been there before. And it's also a skill for life. So if you can write better, you can argue better. Maybe at your future employment, you can argue for a raise, you can communicate your ideas better and get things changed because of your excellent writing skills. So what defines good academic writing? Let's hear some ideas. What is academic writing? What's characteristic of it? Any characteristics? Yeah?
Where the information that it's based on is coming from?
Absolutely, yes. A clear reference to prior work and just embedding your own research in the prior work so that a reader knows in which direction this is going. That's very important, yeah? What else? Characteristics of the writing.
Reproduce the results.
What about the results?
Reproduce them.
Mm-hmm. That they're reproducible. That's a characteristic of, I would say, the research in general, like performing the experiment. It should be reproducible. And then you should also write about it clearly so that if you explain the experiment, others can reproduce it. Yeah. What about the language itself? We have a lot of examples. So we have clear and precise language. Clear and precise, right? You do not want to go off on a tangent. You don't want to use unnecessary words, because in academic writing, you're communicating only your idea. You're not adding your own opinions. You're not going off on a separate little story. You're only communicating your research. So clear and precise, and we're going to look at examples of how to make your writing even more clear and precise, especially in English. Another subpoint of that is concise, so not using unnecessary filler words. A formal tone. Well, this is specific to research papers. They often have a formal structure, as well as using the terminology that's common in this research field. And so when you use terminology for the first time, it's always important to keep the audience in mind and then define that terminology. And then also the structure of your content. So in academic writing, we have a set structure to follow, and this helps other researchers quickly find your methods, your data set, your results. And so we're going to look at that structure specifically. And parallel structure of information is another characteristic of academic writing. When you're writing a novel, it doesn't often have parallel structure of information because you're being creative and you're maybe going off on a tangent. But in academic writing, it's okay to be boring sometimes. You can just list the methods, what you did, how you did it, and just be precise. And it's not going to be very creative, but it's okay to use a parallel structure like that. Appropriate use of citations, you said that. And finally, error-free grammar, spelling, and punctuation, which is a characteristic of all good writing, not only academic writing. And we have some handouts also in StudIP, which will cover just some basic errors that can be prevented when writing. So let's move on with the purpose, right? So why are we writing an academic text? The only purpose of an academic text, a research paper, seminar paper, or your thesis is to directly transfer an idea to the brain of the reader. You're not there to entertain the reader, you're not going to be creative, but you're doing a direct transfer of knowledge. So educating the reader. And this is especially unique in English because when you write in English, you want to be especially aware of your audience and always keep your audience in mind. And you could say you take them by the hand and actually tell them your methods and your results in a way that, yes, doesn't confuse them and just directly transfers the knowledge. We'll look at more examples of that. So we can think of writing as a process. And as any process, it can be improved through repeating the process and revising. Here we have the different steps. So we have orientation and planning. We have the example of when you write, think of it like you are building a house. Because the seminar paper or the thesis is like a big project, but it has different subcategories. So think of the door as the introduction section to your thesis or seminar paper. And then inside you have different rooms, which are your sections. And now these sections or rooms have to fit together. So before you start writing, you should always make an outline, have a plan. So this is this part. The first two parts of the writing process are really orientation and planning and structuring your content. Already taking notes while reading, because then you already have a lot of content to get going while you're writing a draft. So we'll look at some strategies for note-taking. And finally, you have a rough version of your paper or thesis, and then you do feedback and revision and editing and completing. And we also have tips on those strategies. So it looks like a circular process. Of course, you could always keep going and keep revising, but at some point you have to say, I'm done. It's good enough, but you should. Right. But you should still do at least 1 or 2 rounds of feedback and revision. And here it also helps to have maybe a friend from a different field just check your text and give you feedback, because they can tell you what confused them, and you often don't see that. So that's the overview of the process and some more approaches for writing. Like I said, it's a process, so take notes early, write early and often. It can be overwhelming to have a huge seminar paper at the end of the semester, so you don't leave the writing to the end of the semester. You're constantly taking notes, even as you develop. You're programming, right? You're documenting your code, so you're already taking notes there regarding the characteristics of your data set, regarding the method of your evaluation, regarding all of these different components of your research. So take notes on that and also on your reading, the academic literature you've read. And there are great supportive tools for note-taking. So this depends on if you're more a mind map person or a list person. We have these 2 tools that we recommend. Coggle is a great tool for creating mind maps. Here we have an example of Coggle. You can create 3 mind maps for free in this tool, and you can also share the links of the mind maps with your supervisor or friends and work on them collaboratively. And the nice thing, you can just write, for example, different sections in the mind map represent different sections of your paper in the end, your seminar paper, and you can expand and collapse them to keep an overview. If you're not a mind map person, then maybe you're more of a list person. And there's an interactive list-taking tool, which is called Workflowy, where you can take notes and then hide different branches within the lists just to keep it nice and clean. You can expand the branches and organize them in this menu area. And then there's also bigger tools like Notion, which is a great note-taking app for bigger projects, such as your thesis. So for a smaller paper project, maybe one of these tools is great, but Notion is also something you might want to look into as a tool for note-taking. And then finally, we talked about reference managers in the last session, so this is not optional because you have to use a reference manager just to save time and manage your references. Otherwise, it's a big mess. So I personally use Zotero, but we looked at other examples of reference managers. And the nice thing is in Zotero, you can annotate those PDFs and then also export the annotations. So that means you already have some notes to get started for your paper. And so the process for this would be collecting and then ordering and focusing the notes, then drafting. And once you have a draft, you are already almost done. You just revise. And we have some strategies for revising. Easier said than done, right? But once you're at this stage, then you have text to work with. So we're going to look at some differences between writing in English and maybe writing in German or another language. So there's an interesting quote, which is that no matter how you learned in your first language to organize a paper, construct an argument, use your scholarly vocabulary, or consider your reader's expectations, English does it differently. And this is a quote by Natalie Reid, who wrote a book on writing academic papers and getting published. And she has some great tips on what to keep in mind when writing in English. So we're going to look at some of those examples. And generally, we can say, we're going to first now look at what characterizes English writing, and then we're going to look at how writing in other languages might differ slightly. So in English, when we write, we follow what's called Aristotelian logic. And again, we're relying on the Greeks who lived over 2,000 years ago, and we're still doing this today. So Aristotle said, when arguing or constructing a text that's persuasive or effective in communication, there are 3 kind of strategies to communicate. And he suggested using either pathos, ethos, or logos. Now, of these three, which ones do you think are applicable to academic writing? I mean, if we think about them, pathos, it appeals to values and emotions. Think of politicians might do this, or nonprofits, if they want your money. They appeal to your emotions. Or ethos, it appeals to trustworthiness and credibility in a field. Or logos, which appeals to one's logical reasoning abilities. What do you think?
Logos?
Absolutely. Yes, that one is the first one. Logos, and surprisingly, also ethos, but not pathos. But ethos is also used because when we write in any scientific field, we always cite the most credible research and other researchers in the domain that have gone before us. So in this way, we kind of establish ourselves and prove credibility for our own research field. We have to establish it within the prior literature. So that's a way to build trustworthiness among our readers. So that's interesting to think about, right? That even today, we have some of these characteristics that we still integrate into academic writing. Regarding the structure, that in English, we do structure essays in a certain way. And in German, maybe this is a bit less common knowledge. It depends probably what you learned in school, but in English, everyone knows of this 5-paragraph essay model. And so what's in there? A 5-paragraph essay always has an introduction, 3 supporting paragraphs, which are your paragraphs where you make your arguments, argue for your new theory or your viewpoint or what you did, and then finally a conclusion. So typically in this essay model, the paragraphs are reasonably short compared to German essays where sometimes paragraphs can be half a page, 1 page. In English, a paragraph, keep it to 10 to 12 lines. And if you have a new idea or a new explanation or thought, you start a new paragraph. So this is what children learn kind of in 5th grade. They practice this 5-paragraph essay model. And this is already the first step towards academic writing at that point, just to structure your text in a certain way. And another tip is that every paragraph, especially if it's a longer, important paragraph, it starts with a topic sentence, which is important in English because you're guiding the reader. You're doing this direct transfer of knowledge. So at the beginning of every paragraph, you already want to introduce them to what the paragraph is about. So topic sentences are more common in English than maybe some other languages. Another thing that's unique to English is that in your conclusion, whether in your thesis or seminar paper, there's never any new information in the conclusion. Now in German, we often have a Fazit in the conclusion, and there we might draw new insights or have some tips for our readers. But in English, the conclusion contains nothing new, and if you have any insights or future work to share, that would belong in the discussion section, not in the conclusion. So some differences to think about that when writing in English is possibly different than other languages. And then there's also this theory called contrastive rhetoric. And contrastive rhetoric is a theory that was introduced in the 1960s by Robert Kaplan. And he said that different cultural traditions and languages have different expectations of the reader and the writer. So these expectations would be how independent is the reader and how responsible is the writer for communicating their ideas. And of course, these are generalizations, but here's an example of what his theory said, which is that depending on the language, the patterns of writing differ slightly. So in English, he decided to symbolize the transfer of knowledge in a text as a straight line because the writer is fully responsible in English. The reader is not responsible. The writer has to explain everything. Versus in Semitic languages, which are Hebrew, Arabic, Armenian, sometimes the writer might go off on some parallel tangents or embed their ideas in stories that are not a direct line. So there's a bit more diversity maybe there. And then in Oriental languages, it's important to not insult your reader by maybe telling them exactly what you're thinking. So he said sometimes in these languages, the writing style is more indirect, and he symbolized this as a circle because it's more respectful, more indirect, and you don't want to insult your reader by going the straight line. And in Romance languages, which includes French and Italian and also Germanic languages, there we have a similar structure to English, but it's more acceptable to also go off on tangents and maybe explain to the reader some more details that might distract from this clear path. And in Russian, Russian is like Romance languages, but there, if you've ever read a Russian novel, they can leave out entire parts and jump around a lot and then come back to the main narrative much later in the book. So this kind of symbolizes that maybe sometimes they jump around and leave out certain sections before coming back to the argument. So yeah, this is fun to think about, just different cultural writing habits. But in English, we take the reader by the hand. And then we have the academic structure, which we're going to look at now, because in scientific papers and articles, we are expecting the writer to follow the certain structure. And so this saves time to the whole academic research community because they know where to find what. Like, where do I look to find the data set? Where do I look to find the results and so forth? And of course, the structure differs slightly depending on the venue, if you're publishing at a certain journal or some other computer science conference. But in general, the structure is very similar. And this is the overview of the structure. So even your seminar paper and your thesis will be structured exactly like this. You will have the abstract at the beginning. The abstract is the concise, boiled down summary of what you did, and we're going to look at what belongs in the abstract later. And then you have the introduction, which describes the research field and your problem statement. And here it's important to already very precisely state what your research questions are and why those questions are important to be addressed. So that goes in the introduction. Then we have the background and related work, which reviews the existing literature and existing solutions. And ideally, at the end of your review, you are going to point out what the research gap is. So after reviewing the literature, you might find that, well, there's this specific problem which wasn't analyzed. And that's why I'm diving into this problem in my seminar paper and seeing if I can make a contribution in this research gap. And so that is pretty much the motivation of your research for the next chapters, why you're performing the research to contribute something to existing literature. Then you describe what you did, whether that is a theoretical review or an experiment or an implementation. The methods of how you did that belongs in the methodology. And then you have your prototype, not always. Sometimes you might just analyze data. Sometimes you might have a different contribution. But in this section, you pretty much have the contribution, and you would have a technical description of your developed new approach or new system. And then if you did contribute a new system, you do your evaluation. And after that, you discuss the results and come up with maybe recommendations based on your results. And finally, we have the outlook and future work. So that's where you can be creative and maybe come up with ideas for future work, because you're not going to have time to do everything. And as you perform your evaluation, you're going to maybe identify some shortcomings that you had during your research, and then you can discuss these shortcomings in possibly future work, how you would address them. So you already anticipate any criticisms for your work. And you can say, well, of course, you didn't have time to do everything, but in the future, this and this should also be examined. And that goes right there, and nothing new in the conclusion. So finally, the conclusion is just a summary of everything you did in your research, and that is the structure. Now we have a very nice handout, which is in StudIP, and do we have the name? No, we don't have the name of the handout, but it looks like this, and it's just how to read and write scientific papers. So what it is a kind of checklist for the different sections in scientific papers. And this will help you when writing your own seminar paper, but also when reading literature. Maybe also you're going to critique someone else's paper. And so then you can check, well, in the introduction section or in the related work section, these here are the topics that I expect to find. This is what should be in here. And then you can check it off the list. Am I able to answer all of these questions or topics that should be present in the different sections? And if you can, that's great. The paper was covering everything, and hopefully also your seminar paper will cover everything. So it's a good just resource to look at as you write your seminar paper to be sure you didn't miss anything. Yeah, so it gives precise examples of what belongs where. And then we have a full text example of a typical research paper, which has been annotated with the different topics within different sections. So as you read this paper, it's very easy to understand. It has these info boxes to say what belongs where in the introduction and so forth. So another great resource when seeing how to structure your own paper and where to find what in a paper, because you'll be reading a lot of academic literature as you write your thesis. And so looking once at the structure does help cut down the time you need for reading later. Now we have a certain kind of research paper. We looked at the research papers that contribute a prototype or a new approach, but also there's a type of paper that simply performs a literature survey. Who in the seminar is doing the theoretical track? Are you all doing the applied track? Yeah, okay. So in this case, nobody's writing a survey. But the goal of a survey is to look at existing techniques in the literature or existing findings, and then come up with a classification of these current approaches or techniques in the literature. So it's important when you do a literature review that you don't just enumerate the papers you read, but that you also simply contribute your own classification or grouping of the papers that you reviewed according to some features that you were interested in reviewing. So you would highlight only the most significant papers and define your exclusion criteria, highlight advantages and disadvantages of each method in the paper, and identify research gaps. So these are examples of contributions you make in a literature review. It's important to not just list all the papers you read, but to contribute a classification, or you could create a table, and in that table you have the different characteristics that you were interested in reviewing in the papers, the data sets that were used, the approaches used, and then you could have, check marks for things that were fulfilled, and maybe X's for things that were missed. And so in this way you contribute something in your review. Now, this would only be relevant for your thesis, because in your thesis you also review the literature before describing your own contribution. Then there's a difference between two types of reviews. We have systematic reviews and just non-systematic reviews. Have you heard of a systematic review before? So it's a type of literature review that is very structured and follows a specific review protocol. So you would define, before doing this review, the method of collecting the data for your review. You would say, I searched for papers in the following 3 digital libraries, like ACM, IEEE, and another library, and then I used these keywords only to extract the papers, in the fields, and then I also only looked at papers that had at least like 3 citations, for example, because papers with 0 citations are maybe not that useful to the scientific community. And so you define your inclusion and exclusion criteria very clearly so that other people could ideally perform the same review and come up with similar results. And these systematic reviews are very common in medicine because the researchers will review all the papers that looked at, say, drug X for treating leukemia, right? And then they would say, well, in all these papers, we found these different maybe improvements to leukemia, and you would say, on average, they improved the condition by maybe 75%, but the ranges were from 50% to 90%, whatever. So you can make statements about the effectiveness of drugs or treatments in medicine. And then the non-systematic review is what you're probably going to do for your thesis. It is still a very structured review. You define how you performed it. However, it's not as extensive and you don't dive in as deep as the systematic review. Now we have a structure of a survey. Again, it's very similar. I'm not going to cover the details here because the beginning is really the same as any other type of research paper, but then you have the survey section. After the survey section, or within the survey, you would have the discussion section and your classification of the findings, and then also an outlook and conclusion. And this brings us to the specific type or section in the paper called the abstract. So the abstract is just a very concise summary of your research contributions. And in the abstract, you make clear what your research problem was and the contributions to the field and how you did it and what you found. So you already, in the abstract, are very clear about why the reader should read this paper and what you found. Basically, it's just a couple of sentences which already summarize your research, and we have an abstract recipe which I will show you later, and that's also up on StudIP, so you can download it when you write your abstract. You're going to be writing abstracts in different courses probably, and also in your thesis. And of course, you can start writing the abstract, but you're going to have to update it with your findings. So in that case, you would write it last. And we have a recipe for that, which we'll look at. Then we have just a very brief summary of citing in academia. So citing, of course, is mandatory to avoid plagiarism because you always want to give credit to the authors that went before you. And if you built on their research, you must cite in which way you built on their research. And so always give credit. Also, data sets, of course, cite the data sets that you use. Sometimes authors have written a white paper or another kind of research paper on the data set, then make sure to cite that paper. Otherwise, you can also just cite the URL of the data set if they didn't publish about it. And then Isaac Newton said that, well, he said only he has been able to look further than other researchers because he stood on the shoulders of giants. So this is a nice quote to say that in research, we always stand on the shoulders of giants who went before us, right? And Isaac Newton invented calculus and gravitational theory and what else? The 3 laws of motion, I think so, and other things. And he was a genius, but he always gave credit to those who went before him. And this is what he said. So yeah, I think that's quite clear. Then we talked about how to cite last time. So I think we're all familiar with the BibTeX file format, and it looks like this. And so in BibTeX, you can now use this format in a reference manager to manage your entries. And then you can quickly switch between, we don't have the example. Okay, but you can switch between different reference formats. Now, at the click of a button, you can format your references in a numerical format, or if required, in author name first format. So you would have an alphabetically ordered list of authors. And that is just one click and everything is managed for you. So now we're going to look at the strategies for improving your writing. And like I said, writing is a process, and also it can be learned just like any other skill like coding. It requires some repetition, and there's no good writing, only good rewriting, so don't be discouraged if your first draft isn't optimal. You can always revise, and we are looking at strategies for revision now. And yes, Natalie Reid, who wrote the book on academic writing and getting published, said that good writing is not a matter of talent, but of experience and a willingness to work on a text. So you can improve by editing for what we call strength and clarity. So these are the two topics we'll cover. Broadly, you make your text stronger if you leave out filler words and if you make it more concise. So when you think strength, think less is more. And in engineering, we also know the best part is no part, right? Because there's no points of failure. And so in writing, it's similar. The best writing is concise and doesn't confuse your reader and doesn't use unnecessary sentences, filler words. So it's very similar. Then editing for clarity is the second strategy, and clarity is especially important in English because you're taking the reader by the hand and really directly transferring your knowledge to their brain. So clarity is the writer's obligation, and we'll look at strategies to improve clarity as well. So first, the overview of the editing strategies for editing for strength. I said already, less is more. Cut filler words. So what are filler words? For example, if you use words that are redundant, do we have examples here? Yes. Due to the fact that those are that's a lengthy expression of 3 words, even more. And those words can be condensed into one word, because. So there's many examples like this in the English language where there's a precise word that can replace a more wordy word. And we also have a list of concise terms we'll discuss. Then scientific terminology is another way to make your writing more concise and less long if the terminology is defined the first time. So of course, you can use any abbreviation, let's say NLP or STEM, right? STEM, you would first define, this stands for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics as a domain. And then you can keep using the abbreviation STEM throughout your paper. And these are always welcome. Beware of the curse of knowledge, though. Do you know what that is? So sometimes experts, they are not aware of the terminology that they're using because they're under the curse of knowledge, and so they expect other people to already know what they're talking about. So, for example, there's a fun experiment in psychology where they had 3-year-olds enter a lab, and they showed these 3-year-olds a box which had the Haribo symbol on top of it. And so they were obviously expecting to be a candy box or something like that. They opened it, and there were colored pencils inside. And then they were disappointed, but they played with the colored pencils. And then another group of young children came into the room, and they asked the participants from the first study, what do you think they think is in the box? And they all said they think that there's colored pencils in the box, because of course they can't reconstruct their prior ignorance. So they were still thinking, they know that there's colored pencils in the box, but of course the box looks like a candy box. So this is an example of how experts will not be aware of maybe their knowledge, and how other people will have gaps in that knowledge. So keep that in mind when writing to be more clear. Eliminate redundancy. Yes, so we have some examples. Various kinds of theories is redundant because two words are saying something very similar. We have various and kinds. So you can just choose one word. Choose the more precise expression. And lastly, a strategy is dry. Do you know this expression from clean coding? Don't repeat yourself, right? So you don't want to write more lines of code than necessary. You want to avoid repetition, and it's the same in writing in academic texts. And readability rules. Finally, if you can make your text more readable by breaking it into maybe shorter sentences, then this is a good strategy, because if your reader has to reread the sentence, then you already lost them. If you force the reader to go over your text again, then they probably will give up on the reading eventually. So keep readability in mind. Nowadays, there's great tools like Grammarly. You've probably heard of it. And Grammarly does check for some basic errors and gives you tips even on things like replacing words with more concise words. So you actually get a free license for Grammarly with your student email here. So I really suggest just Google that, Grammarly license for students, University Göttingen, and you can install the plugin for Word. So Grammarly will always check while you're writing in Word. There's also the plugin for Chrome, so while you're writing in Overleaf, it also checks there, and it checks your emails. Highly recommend. I mean, it catches the most basic errors all the time. We have another resource in StudIP, so list of shortened replacement PDF handout. And because it's so fun to guess, we're going to look at some of the examples from the handout and see if we can find the more concise expression. We have a majority of, can we make that a more strong word?
Most.
Exactly, most. Very good. And then we have a number of, many or some, yeah, exactly. So just one word. And are of the same opinion. There's a verb for that. Yes, very good. To agree, right? They all agree. So this is a strong verb here, and this is a lengthy expression. So you always have options to improve that. Less frequently occurring. What do we think? Rare, yeah, rare. That's right. There's a lot of words for that. And then we have all three of the. We can cut a couple of the words. The three, maybe, just the three. And then we have give rise to, they, cause, right? And due to the fact that, we already had that one, very lengthy, because, and have an effect on, there's a verb again, to affect. Now, yeah, this here is the verb, to affect, and this here is the noun, an effect. So they sound a bit similar, but have different meanings. Then, based on the assumption that we have if, okay, that one's very short. Right, if this is true, then this. So, nice and short, will be associated with maybe results, okay, yields. So there's an even longer list that we have to use as a checklist. Go ahead.
In German, it's like you're often told in school that you should not repeat like a lot of words.
Mm-hmm.
And for example, for because, there's not really a synonym
Mm-hmm.
in English. And is it okay in English texts if we use a lot of because?
Yeah.
Or,
Absolutely. So my take on this is in academic writing, you want to be precise. You don't want to be creative. So yes, in German they will tell you, well, you need varied language, your reader will get bored. But in academic writing, your reader is not going to get bored, they just want to get the ideas in your head as clearly as possible without getting confused on your words. So there I would say it's okay to use these common words like because or repeat the word. What you don't want to repeat is the beginning of every sentence being the same. Yeah, you can easily avoid that by just restructuring your sentence. But it's okay to also always repeat the same noun because that's the precise noun. Maybe the name of the data set, your method, how you did something. You're going to repeat that many times. You don't want to replace it with a less precise word. Yeah. And then we have more examples for editing for strength. This is an example of how to make a sentence even more clear by always using the positive version. So we have a negated version, and always find a negation and turn it into a positive statement, because that one has less words and is often easier to understand. Examples are, instead of saying not important, there's a great word for that, unimportant. Then we have does not have, well, there's one word for that, lacks. I think it is, yeah, lacks. There might be more words, but this one saves 2 words in total. So another one would be did not pay attention to, one word, to forget or to disregard, I think, or to ignore, right? So nice, concise words. It's also important when you use these negated statements, they can turn into a double negation if you then go on later in your paper to say, did not do that, you don't want that. So if you always start with the positive one, it's very unlikely that you'll have these convoluted negative statements. Another strategy for strength in paper editing is to eliminate redundancy, platitudes, and cliches. We're not going to cover all these cliches, but some of them, we'll look at these later, but also cliches might be last but not least. These cliche phrases that we hear a lot in speeches or colloquial language. They're totally okay when talking colloquially or in person, but they're just too overused to be used in academic writing. So we avoid them. Here's an example of redundancy, various kinds of theories. We already said that when 2 words are very similar to each other, choose one. Then in the month of August, this is also redundant because August is always a month. There's nothing else it can be, so it doesn't add anything, really adds no value. So in August, in January. Last but not least, yes, this is one of these cliche phrases. In academic writing, we would just have paragraphs and say first, second, third, and then you could say finally. So finally, last, fourth. And to a large extent, we can make that shorter. Let's see, what do you think? One word, largely, overall. In a professional manner, there's great adverbs. There's so many adverbs that modify the verb, so we have a precise adverb, professionally, so use that one. And then the true facts, this is an example of a tautology. A tautology is when a statement is always true, but it's also not elegant. You shouldn't do this here because facts are simply facts. So facts are like data, right? In English, at least. In German, there might be a different definition, but the facts are just by their statement, a list of data. Now, whether they're true or not, the interpretation of the facts can be true or false, depending on what other facts we have, what other data we have. We have to look at the whole amount of the research findings, right? But true facts is something we shouldn't use. Also, the fact that, this is kind kind of a colloquial term. We don't want to talk about facts. In scientific writing, we have experimental results and findings. Don't use facts. Then we have editing for clarity. Yes, so this is the second strategy. We looked at editing for strength. Now let's make our language even more clear. Writing clearly is the writer's obligation in English. And these are some strategies. So a text is clear if it's not ambiguous. So we're going to look at how to avoid ambiguity. Then we need to be aware of our placement of words. So specific words in a text, depending on their placement, they can make the whole sentence mean something different. We're going to look at misplaced modifiers and how to choose strong verbs. Then parallel structure in English. We already had a similar question about parallel structure. It was like, can I repeat the same word? Yes, it's okay because it sometimes even leads to a parallel structure, which is easier to read. We'll look at some examples of parallel structure. Then we always want to write in the active voice, active tense. We'll look at how to edit our sentences to be in the active tense. And finally, we'll look at punctuation. And then we also have handouts in StudIP with examples of these strategies. So first off, avoid ambiguity. We have certain examples of words that easily become ambiguous. And one of those is the words they, it. These are very vague pronouns because you're not quite sure what is they referring to, because it's some certain noun that you probably used the sentence before, and then I would have to remember which noun that they or it is referring to. And in that case, it's just easier if you insert the noun again. It makes your text more precise, less ambiguous. So you're not even saving a word by using it or they. If you insert the noun, you're making it more clear and the sentence can stand independently without the reader having to go back one step and search in the text prior. Also, I'm not sure, is it referring to like it, the data set, or it, the results, or they, the authors, or they, someone else, the participants? So don't use these words, and also don't use which and that unless it's one of those connectors of a sentence, right? You might say you have one sentence and then it's connected with comma, which, or that, like a data set that is widely used in NLP. Then it's fine, but if it's trying to refer to a noun, then replace which or that with the noun it's referring to. And if you do have to use which or that, make sure that it's very close to the word that it's referring to. If it's too far away, the reader will have to go back, reread, check, and you don't want the reader to ever have to reread because that means they were lost. So those are some strategies. Also this and that. You already noticed that is problematic. Insert the precise noun. And lastly, in academic writing, we want to use the full version of the word. We don't use contractions. So it's fine to use contractions like can't and it's in email communication and in verbal communication, but not in academic writing. Now some strategies for avoiding ambiguity. We already mentioned this and these. If you use them alone, the reader won't know what they're referring to. So add the appropriate noun. Here we have this discrepancy led to, instead of just saying this led to. These findings are inconclusive. So insert that noun. Similarly, eliminate there is and there are and it is because these are ambiguous. And how do you do that? The strategy is to reverse the structure of the sentence, starting with there is or there are, because the subject is somewhere in that sentence, usually at the end, and the subject should be taken at the beginning of the sentence. So here's an example. There are many domain-specific OCR applications described in the literature. But we can shorten the sentence, get rid of there are, and say the literature describes many domain-specific OCR applications. So here's the subject, the thing doing the doing, and you want to bring that towards the beginning of the sentence. And in English, that's always the best strategy, to put the subject very close to the beginning of the sentence. Now in German, it's not like this, because in German, you often say, maybe the subject is not at the beginning of the sentence, or also the verb is not at the beginning of the sentence, because you might say, on a sunny Saturday, I, with my dog, around the block, went for a walk. So you do have the subject at the beginning here, but the walk, the verb, is at the very end. And in English, it's always a verb-driven but noun-centered sentence structure. So you want to put that verb close to the noun that's doing the action. So you would say, I went for a walk on a Saturday around the block with my dog, something like that. But in German, you can see it's the complete opposite. So this is interesting to think about when you edit for clarity, to restructure your sentences like that. Yeah, in German is a mess sometimes. It's way too long, and the verb is at the end of the sentence. Okay, we already talked about substituting it with the direct subject, so the noun. And then editing for clarity, we have some other no-nos to avoid. We should not make strong verbs smothered verbs. So we love strong verbs in English. I just gave the example with the long German sentence and the verb being at the end. In English, we restructure it to put the action at the beginning. And here's something very sad that happens to verbs. This verb here, in this case, assessment has become a castrated verb. It's no longer a verb, it's now a noun. And the poor verb here that has become a noun now needs a new verb, a weak verb, to make, right? To make, it's like very unspecific verb. And so it needs this verb to help it out so that the sentence works. But what you really want to do is make this smothered verb back to a verb. So we fix it by saying we assess the problem. So put the verb at the beginning, and then your sentence is much more concise and easier to read. Yeah, so a smothered verb are verbs that end in ment, like assessment or shun. Yes, and we can avoid this easily. Then on StudIP, we have a handout called Strong Verbs List, and there you can check if you can replace some of your weak verbs, like made, with a more precise verb, like assessed, analyzed, examined, depending on your research. I already said that English is verb-driven and noun-centered. And yes, use the actual verb, avoid this gerund ing, because that also is a bit more wordy. So here we assessed instead of assessing, but it depends on the context, of course. Sometimes it's fine to use the gerund version of the verb. It just depends on your text, but sometimes you can shorten it. So yes, we have the verb list. Maybe we can close this window because it's getting a little loud. Thank you. And another strategy to edit for clarity is rewrite your text in active form. Now in German, we very often use the passive form, but in English, we use the active form more often. So here's an example of an active sentence. The participants asked excellent questions. So the participants are the subjects that are doing the action. Here's that strong verb, and here's what they did. So the passive version, which is often found in German, would be excellent questions were asked by the participants. And it's not wrong, but it is more wordy. And the flow of the sentence is not as direct as the flow of the active sentence. So here the order is easier to follow, and here you have to read until the very end to see who was asking the questions. So it's very easy to rewrite your sentences in the passive. From the passive to the active, you want to revise them. And in German, I think the passive is still more accepted and more common because it sounds more formal, but it's not more formal in English. This is just as formal for academic writing, so you want to avoid the passive whenever possible. Now we have an example where we can combine some of these strategies we just looked at. We're going to edit this sentence for clarity, and the sentence says, in this paragraph is a demonstration of the use of good style in the writing of a report. And we already circled the wordy parts, and let's see, do you have a suggestion? In your head, you probably already have a better version. So let's see if it matches. Okay, we get rid of these slow wind-ups and some filler words. So we say this paragraph demonstrates. Here is your strong verb. We got rid of the smothered verb, which has become a noun, and then needed this really weak verb is, and demonstrates good style in reports. So much shorter now. You can also say good style in report writing. And yeah, so we have much cleaner sentence there. In English also, it's interesting to keep in mind that sentences, papers, paragraphs, they can be your subjects that do the doing. So in German, maybe you don't say, dieser Paragraph analysiert so and so, but in English, yes, it works very well. This paragraph demonstrates, or in this section, I will examine this. This section does this. So it's absolutely fine to say this paper, this section, does the action. To edit your sentences, just ask yourself, where's the action? Then change that action into the very simple, short, and strong verb. Make the doer into the subject, and that subject should be at the beginning of the sentence. Who's doing what to whom? Eliminate slow wind-ups. Slow wind-ups are maybe if you have a long kind of construction of words at the beginning of the sentence that isn't necessary. You should dive right in and eliminate redundancy. So we looked at a lot of strategies already to make your writing more clear. What other strategies do we have? Yes, we have a type of modifier in the sentence which is sometimes misplaced. So there's certain words that, depending on their placement, they can change the meaning of a sentence. And here we have an example that says, the researchers said on Wednesday they would attend the meeting. Now, because we have Wednesday in the middle of the sentence, it can kind of go either way, right? It could go, on Wednesday, the researchers said that they would attend the meeting, or it could go the other way. The researchers said that they would attend the Wednesday meeting. So we can easily fix this ambiguous sentence by putting, the Wednesday next to what exactly we're trying to say. So on Wednesday, the researchers said, or the Wednesday meeting. So both versions are correct, and I just don't know, based on the first sentence, what the writer was trying to say. And that's a big problem. And also when you write your emails, you can avoid miscommunication by placing these modifiers. They're called misplaced modifiers. And if you Google them, you'll find really funny examples, actually, of misplaced modifiers, because it's a mistake that can lead to miscommunication. Depending on where you place a word, it changes the whole meaning. Another type of misplaced word is often the adverb. Adverbs that are commonly misplaced to be ambiguous are mainly, nearly, almost, just, and only. And this example shows that depending on where these adverbs are placed in the sentence can have slightly different meanings. So for the study, Jane only interviewed Japanese speakers. And now, what does that tell you? You might assume, well, she only interviewed them. So she didn't make them fill out a survey. She didn't perform any other type of data collection, only interviews. But the other sentence says, for the study, Jane interviewed only Japanese speakers. Now here, we are led to believe that she interviewed no English speakers, no German speakers, only Japanese speakers. And so the placement of the word matters probably more than in German. So think about this when writing and ask, what subject is it modifying? Yes, so put it very close to what you want it to modify, the Japanese language or the type of data collection in this case. And another fun example, in addition to causing confusion with misplaced modifiers, is misplaced commas. So learn the comma rules to save lives, because correct punctuation can save lives. Like, it's a difference if we say, let's eat grandpa, or let's eat grandpa. Yeah, I prefer this version. So, yeah. First version is not so nice. And then we also have a type of comma called the Oxford comma. And the Oxford comma can also lead to funny thoughts if you directly translate the sentence verbally. So if we have the first sentence, which says that we invited the strippers, comma, John F. Kennedy and Stalin. So we have a comma-separated list here. And who showed up? 2 strippers, because it says the strippers, and then JFK and Stalin. So separately, they all showed up. Now, without the Oxford comma, it could be interpreted like this. We invited the strippers, comma, JFK and Stalin. So you have a noun and then 2 examples of that noun. And the examples are, well, the strippers are dressed up like they're these 2 people. So that is very awkward. Both sentences are correct, but I prefer using the Oxford comma because I like to have this nicely enumerated list with the comma also before and. So style guides will discuss, do we need the Oxford comma? And many style guides say, well, it's not necessary, but the Oxford comma is still grammatically correct and can fix some confusion. So we also have this comma rules handout in StudIP to just look over once. If you learn the comma rules once, you never make those mistakes again. Just spend half an hour reviewing them a couple times and you're set. Avoid some really basic mistakes. And then we now have an overview of the strategies we covered. So first of all, be as concise as possible. We looked at strategies to make your writing more concise, less wordy, less is more, and without sacrificing meaning, of course. And never allow your reader to be confused. We said how important it is to perform this direct transfer of knowledge when writing in English to guide your reader by the hand. And when using terminology in your research papers, it's important to define terms the moment you first mention them, and then it's okay to keep repeating those terms. And keep your sentences and paragraphs reasonably short in English compared to German, for example. Other strategies we looked at is rewriting your text in the active voice whenever it makes sense. Always let the reader know what you're doing and why. So an example of this would be an introductory sentence at the beginning of every paragraph or at the beginning of a section to already tell the reader what is ahead of them in the section. Anticipate your reader's questions and answer before the reader asks. This is a good tip in general when writing for any audience, but especially in academia, because you always have critical questions. When you defend your thesis also, you will have critical questions about why you didn't do something a different way, or why you missed maybe analyzing this data or this method. And so in that case, you already anticipate the questions and you can describe these questions in the future work section or the discussion section. And in that way, you already, lessen the amount of criticism that you might get later. So think about this, the questions that the readers might ask you. And yes, an example of that is anticipate objections and counter-arguments before the opposition does. And yes, you can discuss this in future work and in your discussion. And then we looked at strategies for editing. And a good text is defined by your willingness to revise it and to keep working on it. And so don't be afraid to rewrite your text. Don't get too attached to your text either. Even if you have a longer text, you might have to delete entire sentences, entire paragraphs to make it more clear and summarize them in a more concise way. So sometimes when I write, I have a takeout text document next to my main text. So this way I can just take out the text that I think is too much. And then I feel like at least I didn't delete it yet. I still have it. So if I need it later, I can come back to it. But at the same time, I'm cleaning up my main text. And then a strategy is also to have a friend or native speaker proofread it to avoid this curse of knowledge, because you can't reconstruct your own ignorance about a topic. Maybe you're not explaining it in the most accessible way. And then we have submission checklists in StudIP, a submission checklist as a PDF where you can go through certain criteria of your seminar paper or later your thesis and see, did I do this, did I do this, did I do this? So basic checks to avoid common errors in academic writing. And we're concluding again with the Greeks because Aristotle has influenced us so much in our argumentating, in our rhetorical conventions, writing and speaking. He said a good style must first of all be clear. So clarity is king. And now after we covered the writing strategies, we have another handout for you in StudIP, which is a recipe for writing an abstract. Now this is maybe not so relevant for you right now if you aren't writing an abstract at the moment, so you can come back to this. But briefly, we're going to look at what belongs in an abstract and how to make the abstract better. So let's look at one example and then follow that example. And also, of course, the abstract will differ slightly depending on if you're submitting your paper one day to a conference or a journal, or maybe the thesis abstract will be a bit longer than your seminar paper abstract. However, the recipe will be the same, and we suggest following the CARS model, which is creating a research space. We'll look at what that entails in the example, but basically you want to define at the very beginning of your abstract the broad research domain, and then say, within this broad research domain, now I'm narrowing down, this is my research topic, like this is the problem I'm addressing. So that's the basic creating a research space. When you create a research space, you establish a territory, so your small niche within the research domain. You define that niche, then you occupy the niche, you get even more specific, and you maybe have a purpose statement of your research, and then you describe already what you did and how you did it and what you found. So what did I do? What did I find? The data set, you should, if you have space, already say which data set you used, which methods, and the results of your research. And that's it. So let's look at an example now. So the topic of the paper here is what makes a link successful on Wikipedia. Easy to understand, it's probably about click behavior for articles, specifically now Wikipedia articles, and how do they begin? They say, while a plethora of hypertext links exist on the web, okay, that's the territory, that's creating the research space, right? The broad research domain is hyperlinks on the web. And of course, these are studied. And so now we're going to see what is this paper doing. This paper identifies that only a small amount of them, of the links, are regularly clicked. Okay, so maybe they want to examine why that is. They continue with asking now, starting from this observation, we set out to study large-scale click data from Wikipedia. So in the second sentence, they already say what they did based on the research niche that they defined. And what they did was they studied click data from Wikipedia. And how or why? Why did they do that? In order to understand what makes a link successful. Then we systematically analyzed effects of link properties on the popularity of links. Okay, that's very clear. So the method, or what they were trying to find out. So the properties of links on their popularity, and how did they do this? How did they define popularity? Maybe they describe here, this more theoretical now, they utilized mixed effect hurdle models supplemented with descriptive insights. And then we find, here they already say what their findings were after the method. We find evidence of user preference towards links leading to the periphery of the network, towards links leading to semantically similar articles, and towards links in the top and left side of the screen. Okay, so we all understand that. Interestingly enough, the placement of links influences click behavior of the participants in this data. And then they integrate these findings as Bayesian priors into a navigational Markov chain model. And by doing so, successfully improve the model fits. And we further adapt and improve the well-known classic PageRank algorithm that assumes random navigation by accounting for observed navigational preferences of users in a weighted variation. Okay, here they also refer to, so like a baseline or a well-known approach like PageRank and how they improved this with their own method. The work facilitates an understanding navigational click behavior, and thus can contribute to improving link structures and algorithms utilizing these structures. Okay, here's the impact in the last sentence. So how do their findings impact the research field in general? Well, they make a statement about that. So you can see it's super short. We don't understand like all of the maybe methodological details here because it's not our research domain, but they covered a lot. And so this is the structure. And in just a couple sentences, they summarized their paper. And so using the structure, you can also build your own abstract. And we have this link here, which you will have the slides on StudIP. And when it's time to write an abstract, you can pull up this template. And again, here, this template is an abstraction of the example we just looked at, where we say exactly what goes in which sentence to make sure you're not using, too much text and that you're staying very concise and describing your research contributions. Yeah, so to review, how are we on time? Good. To review, what we looked at today was first characteristics of academic writing, what makes academic writing different from other kinds of writing, what makes writing in English different from writing in other languages. Then we looked at Aristotelian rhetoric, ethos, pathos, and logos. Contrastive rhetoric is this theory of different cultural writing patterns. And then we have the 5-step writing process, which is a process like building a house, and it's important to already take notes and structure your writing before you get started. Then we looked at the academic structure, what belongs in an academic paper or seminar paper. We also looked at how to perform a literature review, state-of-the-art review of the current research, which you'll have to do in your thesis one day, or maybe very soon. Then we have a brief overview of citing. We all know to use the BibTeX format and a reference manager. And then we looked at these strategies to improve your writing by editing for strength, less is more, and clarity, because clarity is king, otherwise your reader is confused if your writing is not clear. Now, of course, if it's stronger, it's also more clear. So these are a bit related, right? But we broke it down into these two topics, strength and clarity. And writing the abstract, we looked at this recipe, what belongs in an abstract. I covered it very briefly, but when it's time to write an abstract, you have this example, and every sentence in the abstract counts. You will probably be revising the abstract many times because it's such a concise text, and you want to specify exactly what you did in the abstract, what you found, so what you did, how you did it, the method, what you found, and how it benefits the research community. This should be the last sentence, kind of the impact of your research. Now, lastly, we have more resources for academic writing. In general, you can improve your academic writing by reading a lot as well, looking at examples of other good seminar papers or research papers when reviewing the literature, and then taking structured notes while reading. We discussed this. Using a reference manager, which is not optional, is going to save your life with your thesis, and then be edited to keep revising your text. We have these resources. So the book on writing for computer science is quite thick. Maybe you just look at some chapters and take a look at it, but getting published in international journals, this is not just about getting published for researchers, it is about how to write clearly in your seminar papers or your thesis, just how to write well as an academic researcher. So this book was really helpful, and it's easy to read in a weekend. So before you're doing your thesis, maybe look at this book. Then another very famous book is Strunk and White's Elements of Style. Maybe you've heard about this one. But these are the books we recommend. And I would say if you choose just one before writing your thesis, probably Academic Writing, Getting Published by Natalie Reid. And if you read a book like this on one weekend, it does save you a lot of time while you're performing your thesis, reading and writing, and throughout your studies. You know, even if you're going to still do a master's or PhD, who knows, or write later in your career, these are skills for life and not just academic writing, right? This is just making your writing more clear in general. And the references we discussed. And lastly, this is the QR code and the link to the student wiki I mentioned,